Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of Iron Culture presented by Mass. And I know that little addition is leaving some of you in a flurry, I'll be honest. It's leaving me with a sense of melancholy, sadness, but also excitement for the future. But mostly melancholy right now. I'm not even going to lie. I miss my friend Omar. But I do have the neighbor who's come over to make me feel a bit better about this transition. Over from the Obelisk, I've got Dr. Conor Heffernan, who's come to join me. He's sitting in the spot on the pyramid where normally Omar would sit there and I could look fondly over, and at least I see a familiar face. So welcome back to the podcast, Conor. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm your friendly neighbor there with the sugar, the dressing gown that isn't fully tied on properly, and is sitting in a way that makes you uncomfortable. I'm here to bring some of the old back into the new.
And I appreciate that. No, thank you so much. No, it's great. We've got a pretty cool episode today, and this is one of our pre-recorded podcast episodes where we're talking about history, we're talking about culture, we're going to be talking about science. So for anyone who was a little scared, and I did see some comments on the YouTubes, or they were like, oh, I hope this isn't going to become just all science, all mass, all the time. I think you're underestimating how many people like the culture and the history. Don't worry. We try to tell you. It's more just like we got some heavy hitters who are going to be here a lot on the science side. We're not letting go of what is iron culture. And I hope this episode displays exactly that, because we're going to be talking about what is strength, which is a pretty cool question. And myself and Conor are not the only ones who are here today. Back on the podcast is now actually Dr. Adrian Kind. He's now got a PhD in philosophy, which is kind of redundant in some ways because a PhD is a degree in philosophy. And technically, I have a degree in philosophy of sport and exercise. But did I study any philosophy to get it? No, but this man did. And so we've got some real philosophers on the podcast. So Adrian, welcome back. For the listeners who did not see your first guest appearance, introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, happy to do that. Hi. Thank you for having me on again. My name is Adrian. I'm a philosopher of science, mainly in the moment working in Berlin at the Charité University Hospital on psychiatric topics overall. And right now I'm on a research visit in Oxford, and I learned today, because you said PhDs are redundant, today I learned that back in the day here in Oxford, the library was so organized that everything but theology was considered arts, and the only true science was theology. So maybe we're all just philosophers at the end of the day.
Amen.
There's a funny parallel where I met a friend who studies medieval Irish history, and I told him I studied the 1800s, and that's journalism. So there's
way too contemporary, Conor. Come on, 1800s.
Of course, I mean, like 1830. I mean, it's like yesterday.
Awesome. Well, dude, Adrian, it's great to have you back on. And for those who weren't aware, Adrian and I strongly championed bodybuilding. And my first philosophy publication together, which we then talked about on the podcast, there was a voice coming from the darkness, the depths, threatening the sanctity of this core piece of physical culture of bodybuilding. And it said, hey, bodybuilding is not a sport, and here's why, philosophically. And we came back with a fervorous, strong response of saying, hey, based upon the precepts that you put out, we don't think you can say bodybuilding is not a sport. Now, is bodybuilding a sport? We don't know. It might still not be. You could be right, but not for the reasons you said. And everyone was so pleased that we took such a strong stance against this really, really harsh criticism. But no, in all seriousness, that was a really cool experience for me, getting the opportunity to actually publish with a philosopher and kind of really thinking through things in a very logical way. I really do wish, actually, and I joked about it before, that more researchers from all backgrounds and academics from all backgrounds had stronger basis in the philosophy, and especially the philosophy of science, if they're doing quantitative work. I think that would probably lead to better conclusions across the board and strengthen the engine. So that was a great experience for me. And that led to some things like getting to come on, Walter, your podcast. So we've got Dr. Walter Veit, who's also joined us for the first time on Iron Culture. So please introduce yourself, Walter.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. After all, I've listened to this podcast many times. Now, when you think of philosophers, you might not think of people who lived, and to some extent that stereotype is perhaps true, but there are some who do, and I'm one of them, and so I listen to a bunch of podcasts, of course, Iron Culture among them, and it's very interesting to see that a lot of the debates philosophers of science have about what constitutes evidence, how can we think about engage in mechanistic reasoning, to use studies and to talk about how different sample sizes might be good or bad, different philosophy of science questions, epistemological ones. All of these are questions and discussions philosophers have, and you might not expect that exercise scientists engage in this as well, and with quite a lot of rigor. And so I thought, well, perhaps philosophers should pay more attention here, and perhaps we can do some useful collaborations. And this is why I invited Eric and contacted Adrian if he wants to keep doing philosophy of exercise science, really. And that's why we sit here all today.
To ask the question, what is strength? So funny thing that you guys will all appreciate, mostly Adrian and Walter. When I first posted the preprint that we put out on this paper, What is Strength, which we'll have linked in the show notes, I got a question from one of my friends who tends to be one of my more disagreeable friends, and he was like, "Why would a philosopher of the mind care about this question?" And my response was quite literally, because they lift, and there was no response to that. But the point is that I think it is interesting to me that in circles of philosophy that some of the contemporary questions we ask are actually approached and done so in a more rigorous way. So to think that philosophers only approach questions that are asked, by no one, I don't think is true. I think it is cool though to see how do you hold a real justifiable, internally consistent position on something is interesting because using the old topic of is bodybuilding a sport or not, there's a lot of people who basically say no, and if you really dig into it, the reason is because I don't like it, rather than some type of defensible position. And I think a lot of the people who like to define strength in certain very narrow manner, it's because they like that definition or they don't like other definitions of strength. So the interesting thing about this paper is that we wanted to tackle this question from each one of our disciplines, because there have been questions philosophically as to what is strength, maybe even in parallel, published almost exact same time as us, as we recently found out, in philosophy. And there is absolutely a question of what is strength and how that has been asked multiple times historically. And then even in science, we have asked in quantitative sports science, how do we measure strength and what is this as a quantitative construct? And you'd think that would be the easiest one. But apparently, biology is complex. So we're going to dig through all of that today. We're going to talk about this very interesting question. And where I want to start is Adrian, Walter, you guys, tell me how this concept came to your mind and why this was an intriguing question that you guys wanted to tackle.
Well, I already mentioned, I saw that Eric and Adrian published this awesome paper together on what is bodybuilding. And so I thought, there's already another philosopher who wants to write in this area. Well, I guess it's useful to collaborate here rather than try to take my own path. After all, collaboration is, I think, very useful in science. And while philosophers typically don't collaborate very much, that's probably a bad approach. We can learn by taking different disciplinary views and trying to combine them here. And that's what we've done. So I've contacted Adrian if he's interested to write more in this area. And Adrian said, oh yeah, let's do it. So perhaps Adrian can continue.
Yeah, I was really happy to collaborate for very similar reasons. I think philosophers should write more together because nobody is really a genius alone, right? There are always people in the background supporting us. maybe Conor is. The way he's looking is suggesting it.
No one helped me. Road never bottom. Never.
I think history is even more of a lonely discipline than philosophy.
That might have been why the personality is drawn to it. I know. Continue.
So, I mean, the topic of strength jumped to my mind because I tend to listen a lot to people talking in the gym, and I'm not listening to music or anything in the gym. And people ask a lot of philosophical questions. For example, I saw a guy asking another guy, why should I put back my weights? And then I thought, oh, that's actually an interesting ethical question. Maybe there's a paper about the ethics of putting back your weights to write. And then the guy was, I'm not going to put it back. If somebody's not able to leg press at least so and so much, they just shouldn't bother to use the leg press. Is that a permissible ethical argument maybe? So that's stuff I'm thinking about in the gym. And then I also listened to a conversation where somebody said, oh, I think I got stronger. And the other guy was like, yeah, I wouldn't say so. And I was just fascinated by this disagreement. And then they talked about, more plates, but less reps, and so on and so on. And I was wondering, but what's actually the right way to determine when somebody has the right to say he or she is stronger than before, which obviously comes down to the question, what is strength after all? And that was floating through my mind when Walter reached out, and the rest is history, and therefore maybe Conor's department.
Man,
I'm just picturing, John Nash's Prisoner's Dilemma, but with assholes in a gym, where you're like, if we just break them away in 2 separate rooms and tell them that they need to clean up their plates because their friend is going to do it and make them look weak and pathetic, will they clean up often? There's probably a way of doing it. And if we can't do the Prisoner's Dilemma, we can just do the Stanford Prison Experiment, where I get 2 jam sunglasses and psychologically torture them until they pick up their damn dumbbells.
That is one way we could go.
Could go, yeah.
I was mostly thinking like we just need to have an intervention with Adrian and tell him to train somewhere else, because the 2 examples he had there was gatekeeping use of equipment because you're not strong yet. And you're like, well, how do I get stronger on leg press? Well, don't be weak. Okay, cool. And the other person was like, oh, I think I'm getting stronger. Like, no, you haven't. So it just seems like a really, like we just need to find a better gym environment. But then maybe we don't, because we wouldn't have these interesting philosophical questions to answer. So, no, I love that.
You don't train at home, right, Adrian? Just to make sure this isn't like a self.
Yeah, it's luckily it's not my partner who's saying these things. I'm not training at home.
This could turn into an intervention before we talk about what is strength.
Yeah, that was actually his mom who said that. Yeah, so. Yeah. So
maybe it's just a country issue. I think Germans are more critical in general. They're half glass empty type.
You know what?
So
perhaps
we got German philosophers asking questions. What could go wrong? I love it. No, I think it's really cool though. Like honestly, that it speaks to like we may choose where we want to go in life with what we want to study, but sometimes what we want to study chooses us. Like if you're in the gym and you're thinking of, epistemology, when some guy is like, you know what, I don't want to put my plates away. You're like, oh, how interesting, like, then you know what, you were born for this, my man. And it's a pleasure and an honor to see your brain do its thing. So, Conor, I think people would probably be surprised, maybe, if they haven't engaged with the history of lifting, with how contentious the question of what is strength has been. Can you walk us through some of the contemporary history of just how much debate, or not even directly on the question of what is strength, but to some degree, like who gets to have the ownership of deciding what strength is in society?
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons I was so happy to latch onto the coattails of this article, because I've been thinking a lot about this question of what is strength and how strength standards have shifted over time. And it is a really important point to say, like, how do we measure strength? And I don't mean within a lab-based setting, because obviously exercise science and sports science are relatively recent phenomenon. But like, what have been the key modes in which we express strength? One of the first recorded impressive strength feats, that's not mythology, is Bibe and Stone in Olympia in Greece. And it's a heavy stone, and it has inscribed in it, Bibon lifted me overhead with one hand. Now, Charles Stocking, who's a scholar who looks at ancient Greek and Roman physical culture, has seen the stone. He has theories on how Byron pushed it overhead with one hand. But this is sort of one of our first ideas of like, okay, this was a strength feat. But then you go into strength tests. And this is where we go back to the episode with David Keown on stone lifting, or even previous guests who've done Highland Games to some extent, where you look at like historic lifting stones. So things like the Drittvik stones in Iceland, where there is employment, I suppose, element attached to these tests of strength. If people don't know the Drittvik stones, this is the sort of half styrker, full styrker stone. So it's 4 stones on a beach. There's the weakling stone, and it goes from the weakling stone up into the manhood stone, whatever the expression is. And it's sort of like, 10 kilos, 50 kilos, 100 kilos, 150 kilos, or some form of progression. And if you can get the third of the 4 stones, you're allowed to work on one of the sailing boats, because we know that you are strong enough to be on that boat. If you can lift the heaviest stone, then you're at the head of the boat. Or there's some mythology around these lines. There's stonemason stones in Scotland and in Ireland, for example, where if you lift these stones, you are strong enough to be a stonemason. So we have strength tests and strength feats attached to employment. Are you strong enough to do this? And it doesn't have to necessarily be stone lifting. There's a rich history of people showing their strength lifting logs, lifting sacks of hay or bales of hay, lifting horse carts, to show I'm strong enough to do this job. So we have strength tests. What is strength? Is a strength applied to a position? The reason why we're here and we're talking about the gym is obviously the organization of iron game sports in the 19th century and 20th century. And in that time where we start to see the development of dumbbells and barbells, the mass production of dumbbells and barbells, the mass production of plates, which is the most important technology in all of lifting, is adjustable plates that you can easily put on a dumbbell and put on a barbell. How do we lift? Like, this is such a fascinating and contentious question. And before we started, I was sort of rummaging through some of my books, and I have this book here by Gottfried Scholl, who's the former IWF, International Weightlifting Federation president. He wrote a great book called The Lost Past, and it's all about the early origins of weightlifting. Weightlifting is the first iron game sport to organize, even though it's a complete shit show. So the first International Weightlifting Federation competition is 1891. It takes until the 1920s before they regulate the sport into 3 lifts. But he writes about this contentious history in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, where the French are saying, well, the only test of strength that matters is to clean a barbell from the floor to chest height and then push it overhead with their knees together, feet together, heels together, strict back, push overhead. And you have the Germans who are saying, no. Listen, the form isn't really that important. You can continental clean this barbell up your body. So drag the barbell up your body and just jerk that SOB overhead. And that's our test of strength. And like, this seems kind of stupid. You're pushing a barbell overhead. Does the journey actually matter once it goes overhead? But it's so contentious in the late 19th century. Edmond Debenay, who's one of the great French physical culturists, he says that the continental method used by the Germans is for those of a lower descent, and it's a vulgar form of lifting, and it's effectively like that's what the Neanderthals do. Us Frenchmen, what we use as hygienic and safe method for pressing the bar overhead. And the Germans wonderfully sort of retort by saying, listen, you just can't handle the weights that we're lifting, so unless you can press the same weight, we ain't talking here. But you have this contentious history from the 1890s to the 1920s, where pretty much every World Weightlifting Federation meet, including the Olympic Games, has different tests of strength in weightlifting. So it could be a 1-arm press overhead, a 2-arm press overhead, a barbell anyhow press overhead. The 1900 Paris Olympics, it doesn't have a weightlifting federation event. It has a gymnastics event where they push stones overhead for reps. Really weird, but incredible in some respects. But you have different rules being used at annual meetings. You have in one year 3 World Weightlifting Federation competitions in the same year by 3 different countries with different athletes in each of them. Because that's how contentious all of this sort of history is about testing strength. It's only in the 1920s where weightlifting coalesces around the clean and jerk, the clean and press, and the snatch. So you have then, from the 1920s to the 1970s, a pretty easy trifecta of strength, right? Strongest man in the world, because women's weightlifting doesn't actually come about until the 1970s, 1980s, predominantly pushed by the US women's team. It's an incredible history in and of itself. But, you have this trifecta. In the 1970s, John Flair has shown they get rid of the clean and press. One of the worst decisions in many respects. Clean and press, they got rid of it because people were cheating. When they would clean the bar up to their chest, they would engage in a huge amount of back bend to push the bar overhead, effectively turning a military press into an incline bench. And if you don't believe me, you can look at videos or photographs from the 1960s, like the testament to the strength of the human spine. Stuart McGill be damned. I know the limits of, bendability in the human spine. But the IWF gets rid of it because they're saying, listen, this isn't a clean press. It's too hard to judge. So weightlifting coalesces then, clean and jerk and the snatch, relatively unanimous form across the board. But what's happening in the 1960s, 1970s? Powerlifting emerges. And powerlifting, squat, bench, deadlift, even that isn't unanimous. The early powerlifting meets, we can talk about the early precursors, the first powerlifting meet, or the pre-powerlifting meet in the 1950s in America, hosted by Perry Rader. It's a continental clean. So still, take the weight from the floor, press it overhead. Official powerlifting competitions in the 1960s, you have BALA, the British Amateur Weightlifting Association, has 42 lifts. Now, admittedly, they're not doing all 42 in a powerlifting meet. Christ on a bike, there'd be days. Like, how long does a powerlifting meet run normally? And we only have 3 things to get through. 42 lifts. Anyhow. But you had the European system in the 1960s, 1970s. Early days, it was a squat, there was a deadlift, there was a bicep curl. You had the American system as squat, bench, and deadlift for powerlifting. Eventually, the IPF, and we're not going to go into the splintering of different powerlifting federations in recent years, the IPF sort of globalizes powerlifting around squat, bench, and deadlift. Even in powerlifting, we have long discussions about squat depth. We have very contentious discussions about sumo deadlifting, which oddly became linked to someone's sexual proclivities for a certain number of years. You have, is single ply acceptable? Is triple ply acceptable? Is super duper quadruple ply and whatever they were doing in Westside for a few years acceptable? So you had these contentious discussions even in powerlifting around, is technology acceptable? What type of technology is acceptable? But John Todd, Ben Pollock, and Dominic Moraes, obviously 2 of whom were previously on Iron Culture, did a great article on early powerlifting technologies. People wrapping themselves so tightly in bed sheets that it was the sort of early squat suit. Cutting a tennis ball in half and sticking it behind their knees so they could squat more. Like, what is acceptable? So you had these debates in powerlifting. Then you have the World's Strongest Man competition. First competition is in 1977. It's this weird hodgepodge of television entertainment and legitimate feats of strength. World's Strongest Man, and it still has that carny entertainment element to it. That evolves into a semi-legitimate, if not, and then eventually legitimate sport. But even in the world of strongman and strongwoman, you have debate and division. The creation of the Arnold Strength Classic. Terry Todd wrote a wonderful article in Iron Game History. For people who aren't familiar, Jan and Terry Todd are influential figureheads in the creation of the Arnold Strength Classic. One of Terry Todd's articles on the creation of the Arnold Strength Classic is inherently philosophical, going back to Walter and Adrian's point, because he says, we sat around the table with Arnold and Jim Larmer, and we said, is the world's strongest man actually a test of who the strongest man in the world is? Because the world's strongest man, if anyone is a fan, usually has an endurance side to it. We'll use the most high-profile example. It's lifting up a refrigerator and running with it until your knee completely buckles in and destroys your career. Or it's, lifting for reps, or it's doing a huge carry, or it's doing an arm-over-arm pull. Is that actually a test of strength? Shouldn't strength be max effort, minimal time? Is it not a question of the maximum amount of weight you can lift? So if you are a keen-eyed strongman fan, and a strongwoman fan, thankfully, you'll see that the Arnold competitions tend to be lower reps, higher weight, lower time periods, lower distances for cars, because they feel like the strength or the strongest athlete correlates with the most amount of weight lifted. So even though we pretend, and this is again going back to Walter and Adrian, I think they can speak on this a lot more than me, we pretend we have a consensus in the 3 major strength sports, and we can talk about, CrossFit and Hydrox, whatever it's called, and all these different things, or even kettlebell sport. Like, we pretend we have really objective measures of strength. but we don't. Like the most obvious one is, depth. Even look at the contentiousness around Brian Shaw's Strongest Man on Earth competition this year, and there were some questions raised about the squat event in that. But just squatting and powerlifting, bench and deadlifting, is deadlift successful lift if the bar is dropped from knee height down, which sometimes happens in powerlifting competitions. In weightlifting, what is the objective way of lifting it? So we actually don't know. So we don't really often talk about the messiness of those strength standards. I think the only thing that we can agree on is that we have set movement patterns that we tend to link into a strength context. So pushing something overhead from the ground has millennia of history behind it as a test of strength. Now, and lifting something from the ground has a long history within strength. Carrying something has a long history within strength. And now we would say squatting with something has a long history, a more recent, but nevertheless a strong history within strength. So I think consensus exists around movement patterns, but not around the lifts, not around, what is like if you were to give me a weightlifter and a powerlifter and a strongman athlete or strongwoman athlete, and you said, right, how do we figure out who's the strongest? Which was initially the first Arnold Strength Classic had a weightlifter, a powerlifter, and strength athletes. I couldn't tell you what the one lift is because there's so much contentiousness around that. So it's a really interesting, messy, and sort of chaotic history. And that's why I was so excited to be part of this conversation, because these conversations are had within all of these sports, but we don't think of it as philosophy. And we don't, I suppose, contextualize it with regard to strength. Strength sports tend to be very reactive. Oh, they didn't hit depth. Listen, we need to look at our rules. Or, oh, they keep cheating and they're backbending in the clean and press. Oh, let's just get rid of it. It's only when people sit down like the Arnold Strength Classic and even with the CrossFit Games where you're creating a sport from scratch where you get a more explicit conversation around history and the philosophy of strength.
I think that's really interesting and telling. You're right. That kind of reactive nature of strength sport continues today with the new bench press rule change in the IPF, just to kind of put a clear contemporary example on that. So I don't think that's going to change. I think that's kind of be the way and the nature of the more well-established sports. But it is interesting to see, the more modern sports where we're watching them form and change. How we can have, historians sit down with people in the strength community and go, how would we do this? And see a slightly different take on it. And I think that might be one of the reasons why our paper focused a bit on strongman competitions and strongwoman competitions, because there are multiple events. It can change. There's even debate within the sport as to, is the world's strongest man, or is, the Arnold Classic the way we actually tell who's the strongest person? So that is really interesting. And I think people might be surprised to learn in the modern era how different the debates are compared to the way they used to be. Because today we debate, is the world's strongest man or the Arnold Classic winner or the gold medal super heavyweight Olympian in weightlifting, or the strongest super heavyweight in powerlifting, the strongest. But back in the day, it was debates within powerlifting, within weightlifting, and massive upheaval and changes in those sports before they became slightly more stable as we view them today. But underlying all of that, and I think what people don't even really think about is when they get into these contemporary arguments on, hey, what is strength? Or who's the strongest? That's actually what people really talk about. They don't ask the question, what is strength in the contemporary world? They go, who's strongest? And they start to debate, and they don't see eye to eye. And I think many times they don't see eye to eye because they don't necessarily hold the same definition of strength underlying their arguments. So that is where I think philosophy comes into this, because most arguments are people talking past each other. So Adrian, Walter, you guys could tackle this in whatever order you want. You guys could feel free to kind of fill in the gaps of whatever you feel the other person doesn't cover. Talk to me about philosophically what is strength and how you guys were able to conceptualize this, and your best attempt to make it sound interesting and at least understandable. That's the minimum threshold bar, okay, philosophers, all right, for the general public.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So maybe I pick up the ball first, Walter, and throw it over to you, or you get it out of my hands whenever you feel like I'm not interesting enough anymore.
Lift it out of hands. That's right.
So I mean, as you just said, we decided to tackle the question, what is strength, mostly in context of strongmen, to focus on something. And what we first did is that we say, well, if we want to give an account to what strength is, we need to pin down some very central and salient features of what we are talking about when we talk about strength and strongman. And we said, well, what we can see in the history of strength, that was laid out by Conor, is that a recurring, very basic theme is that the person who's the strongest is somebody who can either hold or move the heaviest weight. And we pin this up as the first relevant aspect of what strength is. And then we see a couple of other very salient features in the context of strongman competitions, namely that we somehow want to see that it's getting transparent how much weight is lifted, so that it can be somehow be compared to the lifts of other people, that the performance should be across multiple movement patterns that are assessed, so that we are not only having a person doing a deadlift or whatever, and that the events should be judged by some kind of point values to make them comparable. So it's that we try to get a lump sum in the end of the day to across all patterns to make an overall assessment who the strongest is. And taking all this into consideration, our answer, which on the surface sounds maybe very trivial and easy, as philosophy often does, and which only gets interesting when you start to discuss to philosophers what the words they use actually mean, is that strength is a general agentative ability to exercise difficult physical efforts and certain movement patterns. Horribly long sentence with some words that could all be fleshed out. And I wonder if I can shall I throw over the ball for abilities to you, Walter?
Sure. I mean, Conor already highlighted this with the history. One motivation I had in writing this paper is not to just to, make it like many philosophy papers look, and that is, there's some new topic, new question that philosophers haven't addressed so far, and they write about it almost from the armchair without consulting anyone who may have considered this question before, but who isn't themselves a philosopher. And so here, clearly, in academic philosophy journals thus far, wasn't the case that people really discussed strength. But clearly, people have thought about strength. Almost maybe one of the earliest questions, really, humans ask themselves, who's the strongest here? They can compare each other in terms of lifting heavy objects. They might wrestle against each other. And you can think of sumo wrestling similarly as an exercise of strength, right? And so historically, the one idea we had was that clearly in terms of the different activities that emerged in terms of tests of strength, we can here say, look, this is, we shouldn't perhaps overemphasize this too much, but there is a sense in which there's hundreds of years of wisdom in terms of how these tests have been developed in order to better estimate who's stronger. And there is some consensus, right? We've come to recognize several abilities, such as lifting something overhead, similarly deadlift type activities, pushing something really heavy. And all of this, we thought, is perhaps most recognized in strongman as a sport. And there's one idea that I think was very important here to emphasize, is this idea of proxy failure. Now, you might not know what this means, but it's a common idea in many sciences. Think of education, for instance. We've developed measurements for assessing whether one school is better than another, and many people thought, the government, educational institutions, that this would help us to improve education. But in fact, what has happened to some extent is that the institutions have become specialized in getting students to be as best as possible in these types of tests, rather than perhaps the original aim, which was to improve education. So you can get a disconnect between what a measure originally was meant to improve and then what it is measuring. And you can get that, of course, similarly in strength sports. So in terms of Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, since these lifts have become very specialized, highly regulated in terms of what is allowed and what isn't, becoming as good as possible at this becomes more of a perhaps skill issue, you might say, a pure skill. And whereas maybe a few decades ago, people might have swapped from strongman to bodybuilding, powerlifting, and there would have been more consistency. Someone who's really good at one sport would have been really good at another. Now the specialization has led to this not being true anymore. There's certainly things we can learn from different disciplines. Think of power building, for instance, is something you can do. But because of this specialization, I think we can perhaps recognize that there's some disconnect between what was originally meant to be measured, that is pure strength, and this specialization. And strongman, we thought, is perhaps the most removed from this in terms of the lifts varying to some extent. So while proxy failure can always exist, perhaps strongman to some extent reduces this to some extent. Now, there can still be disagreements, right? Arnold Classic events and so forth. But there's still a philosophical important issue here. And that for a long time, people have tried to get it. And our account tries to spell that out in terms of agentive ability.
And I think it does a really good job. So just to give someone a really clear understanding of what we're talking about with proxy failures, it's kind of the idea that, your SAT score may not perfectly predict how well you do in college or represent the wholeness of your educational ability or likelihood of success. And this is something I can really easily demonstrate in sports science, which we can get to in a bit. But I think a really key element too is that there are certain ways of measuring who are the strongest, which are simply uninteresting to people. And I think it goes back to that point that you said of wrestling. There was a point where one of the ways of who's the strongest, it was essentially who can fight and beat the other person, So, wrestling, combat sports, they are always kind of in the same periphery of weightlifting. And, wrestling and weightlifting were very closely tied historically. And I think that's for some essential element of what ancient humans needed to do and had to do, and how we tested things. So the competitive aspect of it, I think, can't be removed. And the necessity to display that I can do this under certain conditions, I think, is also important. So it's not only a question of the test, not only a question of whether it is more generalizable and you need to do multiple things, but can you perform under pressure? Can you perform against someone else? What I wrote about in my section of this paper was that, and this is actually a great idea that Adrian and Walter presented, the idea of like some kind of super scan, or what we called like the God DEXA or the super DEXA, something that could scan your whole body and measure accurately the entire contractile force of all tissues that you had and give you like an aggregate score. If people just walked up, laid down on this thing, got scanned, stood up, and then we did that 10 times, and in 25 minutes, we would just compare, oh, yeah, you were 88, he was 87, this guy's 86, that's our top three. Congratulations, here's your World's Strongest Man's prize, roll the credits. No one would care, no one would watch that. And I think that's this example of when you really refine something down to an isolated test and you remove the actual component of watching it and seeing it, this is where you start to not answer the question that you originally set out, even though you quantitatively drilled it down to the most purest objective form of it. So it's this interesting thing where it almost has to be a question that is answered in this multidisciplinary fashion. And I won't get into the sports science stuff yet, because I think there's probably more to unpack philosophically and historically. But I thought that was a really interesting way that we were able to demonstrate, like, listen, if we just had people come in, and we don't even have to use the example of a super DEXA. Like if I had people come in and they did a mid-thigh pull, which is, for those who don't know, it's a bar that sits in mid-thigh, doesn't go anywhere. You just pull on it, and we either have a strain gauge attached to a chain, or you're standing on a force plate, and I just get a number. Like, oh, who had the highest newtons? Nobody would care. You'd have to go, like, take the cameraman and film, like, oh, yeah, 10,000 newtons, you're really, really strong. Who's next? And it would be extremely uninteresting. And even though you could argue we've removed all these other factors, this is literally just who is the strongest at this movement right now. It's become so sanitized that it is no longer the characteristic we're interested in seeing people compete in.
So in May 2020, one of the most fascinating things happened in sort of World's Strongest Man lore, which is Hafthor Bjornsson deadlifting 501 kilos during the corona pandemic from his own gym. Jan Todd wrote and it's a blog post, so people may read it, one of the most fascinating articles. It's called Records, Vitriol, and Hafthor Bjornsson's Quest for the 501 kilo deadlift. In the lead up to that deadlift, Eddie Hall told all and sundry that this was not a legitimate lift. Eddie Hall obviously being the first man to deadlift 500 kilos. He said it wasn't a legitimate lift because he couldn't verify the plates, because it wasn't being done in front of a crowd, because it was being done, socially distant. Magnus is the judge, he's not maybe an objective judge. Like, there was a number of sort of insults put against Hafthor. And Jan's article, which I'd read, like, it's an incredibly passionate, historically engaged, respectful no to Eddie Hall. But it makes the point that, strongman has always had this theatric component to it. And that, there's always been a tension in strongman, and certainly in strength, and to Walter and to Eric's point, about how much sterilization is needed. Because, and I love the idea of proxy failure, because, if you think about even the early strong men and women from the 1910s, 1920s, they'd have the list that they themselves would specialize in. And then if on the off chance they were ever challenged by another athlete, they often became unstuck or unglued very quickly. So a prime example of that being Eugen Sandow challenged Arthur Saxon to a bench press competition, and he simply just couldn't match Saxon's strength. And eventually he said, no, they used a gimmicked barbell. There was mercury in it, so when I pressed it overhead, the mercury went to one side of the barbell and threw off the balance. And he actually took him to court and sued him over this, even though it was preposterous on Sandow's part. But there's always been this tension between the test itself, how can we verify it, and measuring the plates has become increasingly important, and standardizing the plates. Now, people remember the build up to that. The videos. I wasted time of my life watching Hafthor put different rogue plates on a weighing scales and showing that each plate was finely balanced to whatever it was, 25 kilos or 20 kilos. And there was this element of, okay, strong man and strong woman is that marrying of verifiable, objective with the entertainment piece. And ultimately, if you don't have the entertainment piece, people don't care. And that's across sports in general. And there is, I suppose, two audiences within strength. And I think it's something John mentioned as well. And there's the immediate audience. So if you ask powerlifters or weightlifters who's the strongest, you'll probably get a really nuanced conversation, including coefficients. They say, okay, so you have your super heavy is this, but actually, if we look at the will score, so it's almost, Taylor Atwood in his heyday, Jesus Olivares, like, where are we going with this? Is it strongest weight lifted, or is it weight relative to body weight? But then you have your general audience, which is, oh my God, that dude from the Game of Thrones thing, Mountain, he just pulled like 501 kilos from the floor, he just ripped that SOB up. And sport needs both audiences to survive. But there is a huge tension, because if you overly sterilize it, then it's not entertaining. But if you don't sterilize it enough, well, then you're going to lose the actual dedicated diehards. And strongman is really interesting, because you have that in both the verification and judging of the lifts. But then every year, World's Strongest Man, because these men and women have a huge amount of training injuries to deal with, what is lockout? And this is often a contentious, and we had this, in the last 2 years at World's Strongest Man. What is lock it? If I lock it overhead, but there's a slight bend in my elbow because I've torn my biceps and I have shoulder problems, this is as far as I'm going. Is that a successful lift? Or is it, going overhead? So strongman, I think more so than potentially powerlifting, because powerlifting has that set trifecta of squat, bench, and deadlift. And although they're changing the rules the whole time, you sort of know what to expect every year. But strongman and strongwoman is constantly innovating. It's, okay, this year we're going to do the Swiss stone lifting, which none of you have ever done, where you're going to have the stone at chest height, run a distance, and then throw it as far as you can. Or I know last time we did deadlift for 1 max rep, but now we're doing a lighter weight for endurance reps. Or we're doing a Dinny Stone walk, or we're doing the timber carry, but we've changed it in a certain way. Because the parameters of strongman and strongwoman are constantly in flux, which makes it unique within traditional strength sports, and CrossFitters will obviously put their hand up and say, well, actually, but because it's constantly in flux, the philosophical debates are constantly there. And you can see, and I won't name names, but certain fans will look at a World's Strongest Man competition, and they might say, oh, well, those lifts favor so-and-so. And, that means that so-and-so didn't get to do it well, even though we all know athlete B is much stronger. But they chose lifts this year that privilege athlete A. So I think there is something about strongman and strongwoman that makes it a particularly fertile ground for that philosophical question, because the judges are constantly faced with this, the organizers are constantly faced with it. And judging by the Eddie Hall, Hafthor Bjornsson back and forth, which was nearly a decade long, or thankfully it seems to have died out, the competitors are constantly having these conversations. I think that's what makes it such an interesting paper, because strongman and strongwoman is borrowing from mainstream or from other sports. It's borrowing from the press overhead of the Olympics. It's in many respects, it's taken over powerlifting with the deadlift. And, you look at the deadlift competition they had in Nevada earlier this year. Powerlifting has never really had that sort of breakthrough interest in the deadlift. So, in the sense, strongman, strongwoman has appropriated the deadlift from powerlifting and made it itself. But I think there's something about the flux element in that sport which makes it, like, the philosophy is just so embedded in every conversation. Even though if I go to an event and I'm like, well, what's your epistemological stance on, and, that'll get crickets. But if I'm like, yo, who's stronger, bro, Eddie or Hafthor? Then we can have a conversation. Or if I'm like, Zavickas, GOAT, am I right? Like, that will start a whole conversation about Zavickas versus Pudianowski and what was the strongest event, during their heyday. So it's a really interesting sport to have those conversations.
Yeah, and if it's fine, I would like to come back to one point Eric made, because it was this thought example of the super duper DEXA scan, right? That is just like measuring your tissue and telling you in some kind of number, which you might think is the strength number. And intuitively, we would assume most people wouldn't be so interested in that kind of results. And that doesn't seem to be what strength in the strongman community is about. And that is where we partly start to develop our definition on. We maybe don't have to go through the whole definition, but only look at this little intuitive piece to talk a little bit about the philosophy here. Because what we see there intuitively is, it's not about what you have and what is there all the time, but its strength seems to be about doing, the capacity to exercise something. And if we talk about capacities compared to properties that are there all the time, we are already in the middle of metaphysical discussions, because there's a difference between what philosophers would call modal properties, so properties that come to bear on what's going on in reality under certain circumstances, versus categorical properties, so things that are always there, like the whiteness of my cup is there all the time. That's a categorical property. But for example, the disposition of my cup to break into pieces when I throw it against the wall, that's a modal property, because that is something that is not realized all the time, but it's in the space of possibilities what the cup could do. And that also seems to be what strength is about. Strength is in you and is with you all the time. We want to think that the strongest man is not somebody who is only the strongest in this very second, but there should be some consistency in this feature of strength that the person has. But also, we don't think that it's something that is to be there, even though it could not be exercised. And that is where this notion of ability comes in, because the way philosophers have thought about abilities is very useful here. Philosophers thinking of abilities, often taking example like the ability to play a good piano piece or the ability to throw a dart or something like this, have thought like, well, what are abilities? Abilities are actions, things that we do with intention and not by accident. If I have the ability to be a very good dart thrower, that presupposes that I can throw the dart in the bullseye when I intended, and somebody who would just by accident throw the dart in the bullseye like 10 times in a row, intuitively we wouldn't say that this person has a good ability, because that's not what's going on here. The same way maybe in weightlifting, if you would say somebody has the ability to do a very good clean, you would want that this person who's cleaning the thing also has the intention to do the clean. And it's not like somebody has a weird kind of sizer or something, and by accident is moving the bar in a way that leads you to judge that actually looked like a very good clean. So there's a difference between these two cases. And we thought the smartest way to think about strength might actually be to say, well, strength is about actions that show the exercise of the intention to do a certain thing, which is within the space of capacities of the individual, which is there even if it's not exercised, but that to itself has this important aspects of exercisability, which seems to be what we expect, which is also the reason why we would reject the DEXA, the super DEXA as a measure, but we would also not say that somebody is the strongest man if he's only able to, is taking super duper performance water or whatever, and is only being able to do all the lifts super good in the competition, and then his capacity to do that fades away. We expect that there is some continuity within this capacity, and this exercisability, presence all over longer time, and activatability based on intention is something that is nicely captured in philosophical debates on abilities, which makes it useful to bring the notion of ability to bear in the analysis of strength.
Yeah, I think one way to look at it is like, let's say you had a parallel Earth with 10 times the gravity that we have, and it just generated these super people. And you put them in that scanner, they're going to crush everybody, including Hathor. And that's just the way it is. They don't actually have the ability to lift them. They might be able to lift these things, but as soon as they actually became skilled and consistently trained, now all of a sudden they compete against each other, and we would see that certain people not only had the quality of strength in their body, but the ability to generally exercise it across numerous domains. And I think that's what we got to, that general agentative ability. And those might seem like subtle differences. And I think in the general public, sometimes people don't understand that strength is both a skill and a product of your physiological qualities. I think that's something that is often missed. And I think you get exposed to this really early when you get into lifting, because you understand that the biggest guy or gal isn't necessarily the strongest guy or gal on a given movement, and that it starts to kind of get bifurcated and trifurcated, and it could be in all these different ways that someone could be stronger or weaker relative to someone else. And you hear things like, oh, brute strength, like they're not a very good deadlifter, but they're just really, really just monstrous, and they're just so big and strong, like they don't need to have great technique to be competing with these other people who have, this more refined strength that we don't call brute strength. Kind of goes all the way back to Debonet, right? So I think that's a really interesting thing, and it kind of exemplifies what you were getting at, and it helps codify it a little bit so that people can understand this in more specific ways, so they're not talking across each other.
This reminds me actually of something I was reading about. So I just finished the book on the rules of Zeus. And why is that related? Well, in the history of Zeus, actually, in the past, visitors were led to compete in kind of strength activities against the animals. So, for instance, you could engage in rope pulling versus a lion or a chimpanzee. And here, to emphasize the skill issue, you might think of a chimpanzee perhaps of having more muscle fibers, type 1 fibers, than a human of similar size. And yet,
type 2, actually.
Type 2, yeah.
I can't help it, type 2. Go ahead.
Very good. Might actually be stronger, right? Just because chimpanzee might not know how to exercise his strength in an effective manner. And what do we say here? Who's stronger? Perhaps you might say, in terms of brute strength, perhaps principle, you might want to say the chimpanzee is stronger. Maybe just we admit whoever wins is the strongest. But clearly skill has a role to play here.
My favorite paper, the Journal of Mammalogy, John Bowman, Observations on the Strength of the Chimpanzee and its Implications. College frat boys, chimpanzees, dynameters, let's go. But I think it's a really interesting point. And Eric, I'm trying to remember the Iron Culture episode where you talk about like what is an intermediate, what is a beginner lifter, and what is an advanced lifter. Or you mentioned as one of the great deadlifters, I'm just going to say Andy Bolton. It's their first time in the gym, pulls like 400 with ease.
600 supposedly.
600,
that's the story. That's
600.
The story, yeah.
But even, like Mitch Hooper was taught that the first time he deadlifted, I think he got over or like close to 400. Me looking back at that saying, oh my God, this is insane. This might be, he's clearly advanced. But the difference in, say, the beginner and the intermediate and the advanced, it is pounds on the board, but more so it is that skill component. And I think there's a really interesting thing around the last 40, 50 years in the strength world. Obviously, there's been anabolic steroids. Obviously, there's been technological changes. But the skill coaching, I think, is such an important element that we often don't talk about. Jan Todd, Terry Todd, Jason Shirley, the invention of strength coaching in America, make a really bold change argument that the most fundamental change in American mainstream sports was not the introduction of anabolic steroids, but it was the introduction of strength coaching. Which sort of made everyone stronger, bigger, faster, etc. But within powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, strongwoman, stone lifting, whatever the case may be, we've become so much more nuanced in the teaching of the skill. People have setups now that isn't grip and rick. If we're looking at a deadlift, there's a really individual lifters filming their clean and jerk 100 times, sending it off to be analyzed by a coach. Like the refinement in that is such an important change from, let's say, a Paul Anderson, mid-1950s Olympic weightlifter, one of the strongest men to ever walk the planet. I think many people would agree with that. He was really skilled for his time. But if you look at his clean and jerk, you can look at that and go, yeah, Jim Schmitz, as his coach in weightlifting, Christ, he could have gotten more. Or if you look at Vasily Alexiev, one of my favorite lifters of all time, and I see his iconic clean and press overhead, and I'm like, that is an ugly way of doing that. That is not an efficient way to move that weight. So I think there is something about that intentionality and the difference between brute strength, Andy Bolton, going in, oh, what's this? Oh, if I pick this up and it's, 600 pounds versus Andy Bolton when he's at 1,000 pounds. And there's we can measure the muscle size, we can bring them into the God Dex and, say, oh, well, now he's at 10,000 newtons and previously he was at 8,000 newtons. I presume that's how scientists talk. Pretty. I imagine the Muppet, who's always like, oh, the purple Muppet.
That's we each scientist gets assigned one very, very skinny person who just kind of screams and freaks out. That's your lab assistant. Yes.
Yeah, great. Internally, all historians have that. It's just called our psyche. But outside of measure muscle changes, blah blah blah, the bodily knowledge and awareness and skill that's been accrued over time is such a huge element in that as well. And I think that's a really interesting thing, is that skill component, the intentionality. It's not just bringing in people off the street and saying, right, who's the strongest. The specialization of strength sports is such an important element in what is strength. And it's oftentimes, I think, lost unless something has really broken down, and then we can say, oh, here's where the form broke down. So I think that's an interesting component in it. And again, it's why strongman, strongwoman is so interesting, because they're constantly changing the lifts. And, you can be really proficient in something, but we're maybe not doing that this year. So now you need to almost like cram for the big test, and you haven't been doing this, and it impacts the training modalities of a strongman, a strongwoman athlete in a way that at least powerlifters know, okay, it's these 3 lifts. That variable is gone. Olympic weightlifters, it's these 2 lifts. That variable is gone. Whereas if I'm a strength competitor, I need to work on my carries while also working on my overhead press, while also working on my deadlifts, while also working on my one-handed press, while also, like, they're spread a lot thinner. But even in that, the likes of someone like Brian Shaw, maybe one of the first professional strength athletes to a certain extent, they are specializing the whole time.
Yes. This is a really interesting thing where we've seen specialization in sport become more and more and more and more common as sport gets more and more divorced from society. Physical culture and sport were far more intertwined and amorphous, and being healthy and having it be an argument for the military or just as a general good thing for society. Now it is much more about health as a rather than a preventative measure of, like, we want to make sure if we get invaded, we're going to be okay. Now it's like, oh, we have a health crisis. People are too sedentary. We have the obesity epidemic. We need to get them moving again. It's viewed very differently now in the modern era than the way that health and strength and exercise and fitness and sport were viewed previously. And character was tied into it in different ways than we think about today. We do put athletes on pedestals and see them as examples and things that we look up to, but it's just not the same as it was 100 years ago. And some of the ideals and the elements of nationalism and things like that were tied into physical culture were very different. And that means that sport is almost a side or a part of, rather than embedded within society. It's something you can go and do rather than something that everybody does or should be doing. And it also means that the individual sports are much more specialized because people aren't just generally physically active like they used to be. They go and do a thing. And this change has occurred in strength sport as well, with weightlifting and powerlifting becoming more codified, more specific. There's harder lines drawn between the strength sports. It's the whole reason why iron culture started, was because weightlifters, bodybuilders, powerlifters, and strongmen don't talk to each other. And there's missing wisdom that they can't pass along. So the training for each of them becomes much more specific. You don't have someone winning the universe and then winning senior weightlifting nationals and then doing one of these new powerlifting competitions that pop up, and to Walter's point, does well in all of them, right? You see people trying these other sports and doing crossovers, and it's like, oh, they're not very good. It's funny, and you see people who are actually much better suited to being in one of the specific iron disciplines. And an interesting thing that's happened because of that I've noticed, the parallel, is that the concept of periodization has even been eroded as something that is legitimate. And when you think about periodization from a more of a first principles perspective, rather than kind of the ideology that's been heaped on top of it, and the arguments and the different systems and the overly scientific jargon that has become ascribed to periodization with sports science growth, you realize that it's essentially just long-term training planning, and it's the concept of specificity being layered on top of that. And when you have a sport, or you have an activity, or you have any kind of physical pursuit that requires you to maintain multiple domains or skills simultaneously, just by the nature of logistics, you have to decide which one you're going to do at what point. And if there's this general agentative ability of strength, and you're competing in strongman or CrossFit or an earlier version of weightlifting or powerlifting that had, 43 different lifts, you're going to have very generalized training, your general preparation, and then you're going to have very specific training once you know exactly what you're going to do in the competition. But you don't want to lose that basic quality. You still need to get scanned by the Uberdex and have a high score, but then you also need to be really, really good at this specific thing. If I got to go face this chimpanzee, well, I'm going to try to get as jacked as a chimpanzee as I can. knowing that I can't reach him, but then I'm going to really train on how to do this tug of war so I can out-strength this brute who I'm going to go against. And that essentially is periodization, with specificity becoming, more important. And the more sanitized the sport becomes, the more I'm just doing a snatch, or just doing a clean and jerk, or I'm just doing a squat, bench, and deadlift, the more we can start to see some of those assumptions that we had about periodization being quote-unquote necessary fall away. And we see people succeed with what we would describe as, say, the Bulgarian system in weightlifting. What do? It's pretty simple. Every time I go to the gym, I do a max clean and jerk. That's it. Sometimes I squat, or the highly specific versions of powerlifting, which follow similar suit. And there's some people who are successful with that. There's a cost to that success. There are, not everyone makes it through that grinder, and you need to actually think about regulation of when you're trying to go for a max. What is a training max versus a competition max? There's a lot of complexity to that conversation, which we've had on Iron Culture. We've had people who've done that system before. But I think it's just really intriguing. And the more you understand how specialized strength can be, I think the more all this starts to make sense. And this is where I want to go on a little bit of a tirade on sports science here, if you guys will all indulge me. So we think that objectivity is the true, razor that can cut things and give us clear answers. And, you'll have quantitative researchers who can't help but get annoyed anytime the notion of qualitative research pops up around them. It's a personality thing. We like to have clear answers. But any good quantitative researcher will tell you that the first thing you got to do is define your terms, right? I can give you a very specific, correct answer. I can provide you objective truth. And believe it or not, sorry philosophers, sorry historians, sorry sociologists, we do actually live in a physical world, The idea is that if we could measure the movement of every single molecule and atom in the world and predict it, we could know what was going to happen next. And that's probably true. Now, that would take more energy than exists in the world which we're trying to measure, so it's never going to happen. So it's not a useful perspective, but it is true. We do live in a physical world. So what that means is that if we define something very narrow, if I want to know what is your one repetition maximum on a given lift, we can measure that. But here's what gets interesting. You can take a bunch of people with higher one repetition max deadlifts, and you can test them on a machine of isolated back extension that locks your body in place, and all you do is basically a back extension, and we see how much force you produce. There's very little correlation between the two, and this has actually been done. We had Dr. Pack on to talk about this when he did this research at Solent University when he was still a student. And they brought in a bunch of powerlifters, really strong RDLs, really strong deadlifts, but they didn't necessarily predict their isolated back extension strength, which is crazy. So there's movement specificity that's going on. There's also the influence of the speed of the movement. Are we talking about power, which is force times velocity? And then is it more velocity or more force dominant? And each individual person, depending upon their training and their natural characteristics, has a different force velocity profile. And they also have a different endurance strength profile. So you can find someone, and we've already talked about this in strongman, who might be able to deadlift, say, 600, 700 pounds for 10 reps, right? But their max might only be 800. But there might be someone with a max of 900 who can also only do the same number of reps at that same given load. And we see this play out in sports science all the time. The further you get away from the actual activity, the more the variance increases because of these individual factors. And you think, and that's only true if you compare like an endurance athlete to a strength athlete. That magnifies it. Like there was a study done where they looked at 1RM testing of the leg press, then they had them do as many reps as possible at 90 and 80 and 70% of that 1RM leg press. And they used strength athletes and endurance athletes. Huge differences in all of them, right? And they go, okay, well, all we got to do to solve that is we just compare people who just lift weights, right? Because they did see like 40 reps versus 20 reps and 80% on the leg press. Like, oh my God. And that's the mean. But it only cleans up a little bit. So out of Dr. Zerdos' lab, we did a study where we took people who could at least squat 1.5 times body weight if they're a male or 1 times body weight if they're a female, and had been training for at least a year and consistently squatting, tested their 1RM, And then I had him do an AMRAP, as many reps as possible at 70% of 1RM. And the range was from 6 to 26 reps. So that means there's people who you go, yeah, do 10 reps at 70%. That should be, a challenging set. Some people are like, yeah, I got 16 more, bro. That was a warm-up. Other people who are like, yeah, I failed on rep 6 and I got pinned and there was no spotters around because I thought that wouldn't happen. And these are all people who primarily lift weights and are all reaching a certain strength standard. So you're going to have someone who can throw a shot put really far, but doesn't have as big as a 1RM bench press as someone else who can't throw it just as far. You're going to have people who are really strong at this movement versus that movement. You're going to have people who have more eccentric strength than concentric strength, or they have more isometric endurance, and they could probably really succeed on the Hercules hold, for an example, but couldn't do something else. So, ironically, it is the very, very specific quantitative approach of defining strength and measuring it that tells us two things. One, if we sanitize it down to just a singular measure, A, nobody cares, but B, it demonstrates proxy failure. So almost by definition, the only way for us to define who is the strongest is requiring a multi-component test that goes across some of these various physiological qualities of the body, that through the history and the philosophy, we can say, you know what, all of these could categorize themselves within these. Like if we have this definition philosophically of what is strength, and if we look at historically, what do people care about and see and are interested in tests of strength, it's varied, which is why people debate. So we're forced into this position of, well, we've got to have a battery of tests, and someone needs to be consistently good across all of them. They may not be the best at any single one because that's too specialized. Now it's the SAT score, right? Or it's the squat specialist who can't bench, etc. And I think that's really interesting, and it speaks to the fact, and I'll make a claim here, that someone who can consistently win, say, World's Strongest Man or World's Strongest Woman, even when the sport changes and every year there's different events, and also say win the Arnold, if they are the dominant champ for multiple years in a row, or they've always got a shot across the various different disciplines and tests that exist in strongman, and they can do well in the more endurance-focused event of World's Strongest Man and the more strength-focused event in Arnold Classic, that is an impressive athlete who probably has, in my opinion, at least a more broader and more defensible claim to being the strongest than even your top gold medalist or super heavyweight weightlifter or powerlifter, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing. And I have a book here beside me, very, very war-torn. David Willoughby, the super athletes. David Willoughby was just an incredible fitness writer from the mid-century of the super athletes. He went around and he said, well, I'm going to categorize every strength feat that I can. So it's about 1,000 pages long, and in the index, it's endurance lifting. It's talking about, Anthony McGinty, who pushed a 2-pound dumbbell overhead 14,000 times in a day. It's talking about Tom Burrows, the club stringer, who swung Indian clubs for 120 hours without rest. The index is such a fascinating. Bear in mind, he wrote this book before World's Strongest Man, and he breaks the feats of strength up across different eras, the ancient world, the modern world. He then goes into chinning, rope climbing, dipping, wrist wrestling, strength of neck and jaws, log chopping, tug of war, boxing, skating, pole vaults, shot put, barbell sports, all of these different things. Because he was grappling with, and it's meant to be a record of human strength, speed, and stamina, but he was grappling with who's the strongest in a time before strongman, and then eventually strongwoman. And it's interesting to see how many things Willoughby, who's sort of one of the experts in popular fitness circles of his time, and that's some really interesting anthropomorphic work as well. But he was grappling with this before there was a sport around. So he's looking at chin-ups and dips and calisthenics and club swinging and things that I think strongman and strongwoman have simplified. But you're right, Eric and Adrian and Walter. The way you get to who's the strongest is to set out with the okay, we understand we're not going to be able to test anything. Let's use history and philosophy as tent poles or guides for what is the most acceptable and non-niche test of strength. Let's also use entertainment, because don't forget, the first World's Strongest Man was done effectively mimicking superstars, the show where they were like, let's get an American footballer and put them against a sprinter and put them against, a gymnast and see who's the best athlete. That World's Strongest Man was like the Wish.com version of that, effectively. Like, it was just, oh, that works. Okay, yeah, let's do that. Oh, kitty cat videos are doing popular. I'm going to do a kitty cat video. But they simplified it down. So it's the history, it's a philosophical conversation. It's also that entertainment piece as well, because there probably is. It's like grip strength. You could do a grip strength event where you're literally like, just, squeeze this as hard as you can and we're going to test the force that's gone into it. Or we can do the Hercules hold, and we can get Mark Felix to stand there for like 5 minutes. And I don't know why it's entertaining, because it's such a long period of time, exactly speaking. But it's so awesome to see that. So it's like, there's all of those tensions around it, that it isn't actually objective, but we set out a framework to be as objective as possible within that framework. And then we use arbitrary rules within that framework. Like, figure 8 straps are allowed in strongman and strongwoman. If I even had normal lifting straps in a powerlifting competition, I'd be kicked out. Do you know what I mean? So like, we sort of tack things on. There's all these little intricacies in it. But you do actually have to sit down and stop. And it is funny, if we look at the creation of CrossFit in the early 2000s, and it was like, we're going to test holistic strength and, it's going to be testing across multiple modalities. But what has CrossFit done? It's effectively specialized. Now, they have so many workouts in the days, etc. But you look at CrossFit Games, it's effectively specialized now, and they've gotten rid of certain events and certain lifts and kept other lifts and events. You need to set the menu. And not everyone's going to be happy about that, but you need to set the menu in a way that's going to be tasty, it's going to be palatable, and these are things that I think we often lose in the sporting side of it. I think we do often lose in the strength and exercise side of it as well, is that there's this really important cultural component to strength. And then there are other elements to that we could talk about. World's Strongest Man and the Arnold, it uses predominantly Western tests of strength. This stone lifting has changed and upended that, but it tends to be a more Western dominant framework. We tend not to see, non-white tests of strength, and sometimes there are differences to that. The World's Strongest Man, when it was hosted in China, they did ding lifting, the heavy cauldron lifting, which was the traditional feat of strength in China for so many years. I would really be interested in seeing more of the Japanese and Indian stone lifting events, at the Arnold, where they tend to play around with this in regional tests of strength. But like, even that, we're looking at it through a specific lens. So like, you can problematize it really easily, but I think you all have to accept the constructed nature of these events and the fact that these events aren't static, and that goes across different paradigms. How someone squats now is very different to the 1960s. A deadlift now is to me, a deadlift in a powerlifting competition, when I went to the first Sheffield, it's art and science together. There's a beauty in the efficiency of how these male and female athletes exert that much force through their body. And, is one of these athletes stronger in brute strength than Paul Anderson? Probably not in the case of some of them, but the efficiency of it is another element. So there's just so much to unpack, I think, with that. But it is that interesting point of, you need to sit down and have that philosophical conversation about what do we include, what do we exclude, and the why is so important in that.
Yeah. Without the why, people just don't care, So this has been really fascinating. I hope no one thought we were going to answer very clearly what is strength on a podcast titled What is Strength. It's true. Yeah, exactly.
2, 3, 4. We know the answer. The whole paper, just write on 2, 3, 4.
Read the paper.
Yeah, read the paper. Yeah. But I think we do a good job outlining why it is so difficult to pin down, and maybe if one was to pin it down, what they would need to do. Respect the differences in different qualities of physiological force production capacity from sports science. Respect the cultural and historical notions, the changing, cultural notions of strength over time, and then making sure that you're internally consistent with identifying what is strength as a general agentative ability. And I'd like to think we did a pretty good job with that. And I think it makes for a fascinating read. But I just want to say thank you to everyone for being on this discussion. And I also want to open it up. Is there anything you guys feel we haven't covered before we sign off?
Something I'd like to ask Adrian and Walter in particular, which I'm fascinated about, and I don't have the intellect to figure this out, is the importance of numbers. And I have a really good example of this. Lasha, the super heavyweight, it now looks like the Olympic weightlifter, it looks like he'll never, unfortunately, reach his goal of getting 500 kg total. So for some in the weightlifting community, there's a bit of ennui and disappointment that, Lasha hasn't hit this completely arbitrary number. But there's something about, maybe you could talk about the philosophical element of this. There's something really interesting about round numbers. For some, we just attach so much importance to it. So Lasha's best total, Eric, you might remember, is it 492 maybe?
Yeah, something like that.
It's sort of just shy of 500. But even if you think of half Thor, Eddie Hall doing the 500, and there's this big whole thing. If anyone's a fan of Stack Brothers, it's it's the Catalina wine mixer. We're just arbitrarily imbuing this certain number with so much importance over, if someone's a 499 kilo deadlifter, objectively fucking impressive. But if I say they're a 500, that's leaps and bounds ahead. Lasha got 492 at career total best, but he didn't hit 500. So I'm like, oh, you need to hit. So are there philosophical terms for why certain numbers get linchpinned, or they're almost like a hinge between human and superhuman, which I think we see in a lot of these different. We just arbitrarily say, in powerlifting, once you join the 1000 club, oh, well, now, you've a certain level of gravitas. I'm rambling, please jump.
I think there's a general thing that once you add another zero, things become quite amazing. I mean, my first 100 citations, I just attached some special meaning to that. And once that was passed, Google Scholar sends me a nice message with some confetti. Wonderful, beautiful. Thank you. So I think there's something very widespread about this across all fields, wherever there are numbers involved.
And I could imagine that around certain abilities, there are ability cultures. For example, if you think of a piano player who's very good in playing Bach, maybe there will he might not be a better piano player if he has recorded every single piano concert of Bach, but it will not make him better if you recorded all of them or all but two of them. But nonetheless, it's maybe part of his legacy to be one of the few who recorded all of the concerts. And that is maybe part of the specific culture of being a very impressive concert pianist. And maybe we have something like this in every skillful pursuit. Maybe philosophers think about certain journals they want to publish in during their career, or all scientists want to hit citations. Or I would imagine historians, help me out, Conor, I would imagine historians like to go to certain places or something they write about.
Get permanent employment.
Oh,
job.
It's the dream.
I think a lot of it has to do with thresholds, Conor.
Yep.
It's easier to have a unified perspective on what is a certain threshold when it is a round number. Even though no one's hit 493 since Lasha's 492, it isn't quite the same. Even the 501 deadlift, it's more than 500, but now we kind of don't care until someone hits 550 or something like that. And I think this is demonstrated by pound versus kilo lifting, because there's a visual component as well, like 315, 225, 405, 495, 585. These are numbers every American lifter knows because they're when you add another 45-pound plate, and they're really impressive thresholds. But then if you get outside of that, it's each 100 kilo increment, right? So I think there's that, and then there's the threshold element, who's going to run the first 4-minute marathon or 4-minute mile, or the 4-hour marathon, or all the various thresholds that are out there. I think those are these things that allow us to coalesce around an understanding of a new level of achievement not previously seen. I think we do care about breaking a record by 1 kilo, but it doesn't have the same easily translatable across society meaning is my guess. But yeah.
Can I ask a final annoying question and ask the philosophers to put themselves on the chopping block?
Sure.
Legend goes that Plato is actually his nickname and is either broad-shouldered or big forehead. Are we landing on he was a nerd with a big head, or he was a lifter who was broad-shouldered?
Well, I like the legend that it was his wrestling coach who gave him that name, man. It's a kind of badge of honor.
Well, as we know, Plato means plate, right? So it was referring to the weight plates that had been early invented at that time. Haven't found them yet with archaeological records, but I'm pretty sure it's a thing.
Yeah. You mean somebody said, add a plate to the bar, and that's where Plato comes from, right?
Boom. That's all it is. That's simple.
And that's history.
All right. Well, we got the sign off from Dr. Conor Heffernan that is indeed history. You heard it here, folks. Plato was named after the plates he used to lift. More plates, more dates? Question. Who knows? But no, in all seriousness, I really appreciate you guys coming on. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I would encourage anyone who wants to do a deeper dive into this to definitely check out the preprint of our article that's currently in peer review asking the question, what is strength? Taking a sports science historical and philosophical angle at it. And for everyone who has not been here before and is new to the podcast, welcome. And for everyone who's been here for a while, you know the slight tax we have on you joining us, and that is hitting the like button. And if you really want even additional extra credit, please leave a rating and review. Most people seem to leave 5 stars. So if you would like to continue that tradition, as we have seen is very important in this episode, please do so. And if not, that's okay. We won't judge you too much, but we would love to have you back. And maybe our next episode, you'd consider giving a 5 stars, because we'll be trying very hard, being the dancing monkeys for the algorithm, to make you happier on that next Monday, where we're going to be live when we do live episodes, which are now coming out on the podcast feed on Wednesday. And thank you for tuning in to this episode of Iron Culture presented by Mass.